There was a time when small American churches brought entire communities together through simple homemade food. Long before modern catering and restaurant chains became part of everyday life, families gathered inside church basements and community halls, carrying warm casseroles, handwritten recipes, homemade desserts, and dishes passed down through generations. Some of those recipes became legendary, others slowly disappeared over time. Tonight, we're going back to the forgotten church potluck recipes of old America. And few potluck dishes became more famous across old American churches than green bean casserole. Few recipes became more connected to American church potlucks than green bean casserole. For generations, the dish appeared on folding tables beside casseroles, pies, baked ham, and handwritten recipe cards inside church basements across the United States. Today, many people associate it mostly with Thanksgiving dinners, but long before that, green bean casserole quietly became one of the most dependable and recognizable dishes at community gatherings throughout small-town America. The recipe first became widely popular during the 1950s, when simple canned ingredients transformed the way many American families cooked at home. At the time, convenience foods represented modern life. Busy families wanted recipes that were affordable, filling, and easy to prepare for large groups without spending entire days inside the kitchen. And green bean casserole fit perfectly into that world. Creamy mushroom soup, green beans, milk, and crispy fried onions created something warm, salty, rich, and comforting enough to feed entire church gatherings after Sunday services and holiday events. The dish quickly spread through community cookbooks, church recipe collections, and handwritten family cards passed between neighbors and relatives. And over time, it became more than just a recipe. It became part of American community life itself. Inside small churches across rural towns and quiet suburbs, tables filled with casseroles became symbols of togetherness. Families gathered after funerals, weddings, charity dinners, and Sunday services, sharing homemade meals prepared early that morning inside kitchens across town. Children ran between folding chairs. Coffee brewed endlessly in metal pots. Older women exchanged recipes, while volunteers carried trays of food beneath fluorescent church basement lights. And somewhere in the middle of nearly every table, there was usually green bean casserole. Even today, the dish still feels deeply nostalgic for many Americans because it represents a version of community life that slowly disappeared over time. Simple meals, small gatherings, neighbors bringing food for one another without needing invitations or special occasions. To recreate a traditional green bean casserole today, you would need green beans, cream of mushroom soup, milk, soy sauce, black pepper, and crispy fried onions. First, combine the green beans, soup, milk, soy sauce, and pepper inside a baking dish. Mix everything together carefully until fully coated. Top the casserole generously with crispy fried onions and bake until hot and bubbling around the edges. Some families added cheese or extra onions on top, depending on local traditions. Serve warm beside mashed potatoes, ham, or roasted chicken. Creamy, salty, comforting. A church potluck classic once found on folding tables across old America during holidays, community dinners, and quiet Sunday afternoons. And maybe recipes like this still survive because they remind people of a time when food brought entire communities together in ways that modern life rarely does anymore. But while casseroles became staples of nearly every church gathering, some potluck recipes became unforgettable simply because nobody could quite explain why they existed in the first place. Few forgotten church potluck recipes confuse younger generations more than Ambrosia Salad. At first glance, the dish barely even looks like a salad at all. Instead, it resembles something halfway between dessert, fruit bowl, and pure 1950s Americana. But for decades, Ambrosia Salad appeared at countless church gatherings, holiday dinners, family reunions, and potluck tables across the United States. But while sweet salads and desserts became unforgettable parts of church gatherings, some recipes remained popular simply because they were impossible to stop eating once they appeared on the table. And somehow, people absolutely loved it. The recipe became especially popular during the 1950s and 1960s when brightly colored convenience foods, canned fruit, marshmallows, and whipped toppings became symbols of modern American home cooking. At the time, recipes were designed not only to taste good, but also to feel cheerful, affordable, and easy to prepare for large gatherings. Ambrosia Salad fit perfectly into that world. The dish usually combined canned fruit, mandarin oranges, pineapple, coconut, whipped cream, sour cream, and miniature marshmallows into one cold, sweet mixture served inside enormous glass bowls during church dinners and holiday celebrations. And while the recipe might sound unusual today, for many Americans growing up during that era, it became deeply nostalgic. Inside church basements and fellowship halls across small-town America, tables filled with homemade food often included at least one enormous bowl of Ambrosia Salad, placed somewhere between casseroles and desserts. Children loved the sweetness. Adults loved the simplicity, and volunteers preparing food for large gatherings appreciated recipes that could feed dozens of people quickly without requiring expensive ingredients or complicated preparation. Over time, dishes like this became part of the personality of church potluck culture itself. Bright fluorescent lights, metal folding chairs, coffee brewing beside dessert tables, the sound of conversation echoing softly through community halls while families carried paper plates piled high with homemade food. And somewhere near the desserts, there was almost always Ambrosia Salad. Even today, the dish remains strangely fascinating because it captures a very specific moment in American food history when convenience, optimism, and community gatherings shaped the way people cooked for one another. To recreate a traditional Ambrosia Salad today, you would need mandarin oranges, pineapple chunks, miniature marshmallows, shredded coconut, whipped topping, sour cream, and maraschino cherries. First, drain the fruit carefully before combining everything inside a large bowl. Fold the whipped topping and sour cream gently into the mixture until fully combined. Add marshmallows, coconut, and cherries before chilling the salad for several hours. Some families added pecans or grapes depending on local traditions. Serve cold inside large glass bowls during gatherings and celebrations. Sweet, cold, colorful. A church potluck classic once found at countless American community dinners during the golden age of homemade comfort food. And maybe recipes like this still survive because they remind people of a more innocent version of American community life, filled with laughter, conversation, and folding tables covered with homemade dishes. Few church potluck recipes became more reliable, recognizable, and impossible to ignore than deviled eggs. For generations, nearly every American church gathering, holiday dinner, funeral reception, picnic, and community potluck seemed to include at least one large tray of carefully prepared eggs sprinkled with paprika and arranged in perfect rows. And somehow, they always disappeared first. The recipe itself dates back much farther than most people realize. Versions of stuffed eggs existed in Europe for centuries before eventually becoming deeply woven into American food culture during the late 1800s and early 1900s. But inside American church communities, deviled eggs became something special. Simple ingredients transformed into a dish that looked elegant enough for celebrations while still remaining affordable enough for large gatherings. And during decades when many families needed recipes capable of feeding entire groups without spending too much money, deviled eggs became one of the safest choices imaginable. Eggs were inexpensive. The preparation was simple. And large trays could be prepared ahead of time before Sunday services, weddings, holiday dinners, and community events. Inside church fellowship halls across America, trays of deviled eggs quickly became part of the atmosphere itself. Metal serving trays covered in plastic wrap, coffee brewing endlessly near folding tables, children running between chairs while adults exchanged recipes beneath fluorescent lights after Sunday morning sermons. And somewhere near the center of nearly every table, there were always deviled eggs. Every family prepared them slightly differently. Some added mustard and paprika. Others used relish, pickles, vinegar, or even hot sauce depending on regional traditions passed down through generations. And strangely enough, people often became fiercely protective of their own family recipe versions. For many Americans, deviled eggs still feel deeply nostalgic because they represent gatherings that were less about the food itself and more about community. Neighbors bringing dishes for one another. Families gathering after difficult funerals or joyful weddings. Small towns coming together around folding tables filled with homemade comfort food prepared early that morning inside quiet kitchens across town. To recreate traditional church-style deviled eggs today, you would need eggs, mayonnaise, mustard, vinegar, salt, black pepper, and paprika. First, boil the eggs until firm before carefully peeling them and slicing them in half. Remove the yolks and mix them with mayonnaise, mustard, vinegar, salt, and pepper until smooth and creamy. Spoon or pipe the filling back into the egg whites before sprinkling paprika lightly across the top. Some families added pickles, relish, or chopped chives depending on tradition. Serve cold on large trays during gatherings, holidays, and community dinners. Simple, creamy, familiar. A church potluck classic, quietly shared across generations of American families, gathered together inside community halls and fellowship dinners throughout old America. And maybe recipes like this still survive because they remind people of a time when homemade food carried a sense of togetherness that modern life slowly began to lose.
But while recipes like deviled eggs became familiar at nearly every gathering, some church dishes became unforgettable simply because their names sounded far stranger than the food itself.
Few church potluck recipes have a name as strange or as unforgettable as funeral potatoes. At first glance, the title sounds almost darkly humorous. But throughout large parts of the American Midwest and Mountain West, especially within tight-knit church communities, the dish became deeply connected to one of the most important traditions in small-town American life: bringing food to grieving families. For generations, churches across America organized community meals after funerals where neighbors gathered together to support families experiencing loss. And because those meals needed to feed large numbers of people quickly, recipes that were inexpensive, filling, warm, and easy to prepare became essential. That's where funeral potatoes entered American food culture. The dish itself was rich, creamy, and designed entirely around comfort. Shredded potatoes, cheese, sour cream, butter, cream soup, and crunchy toppings combined into one enormous casserole, capable of feeding entire fellowship halls after long emotional afternoons. Inside church basements, trays of funeral potatoes often sat beside baked ham, casseroles, rolls, coffee, and homemade desserts, while quiet conversations filled community halls beneath fluorescent lights. And over time, the unusual name stopped sounding strange to the people who grew up around those traditions. Instead, it became something deeply familiar. Because the recipe represented more than food. It represented care. Neighbors helping neighbors, entire communities gathering together during difficult moments without needing to be asked. For many Americans raised inside small church communities, recipes like this became connected to memories far bigger than the ingredients themselves. Children sitting quietly beside parents during post-funeral dinners. Women carrying steaming casserole dishes wrapped carefully in towels from car parking lots into church kitchens. Coffee brewing endlessly while people shared stories late into the evening after long, difficult days. And somehow, through all of it, there were always funeral potatoes. Even today, the dish remains surprisingly beloved throughout parts of America because it still feels deeply comforting. Warm, creamy, heavy. The kind of food designed not for celebration, but for helping people feel less alone. To recreate traditional funeral potatoes today, you would need shredded potatoes, cheddar cheese, sour cream, cream soup, butter, onions, crushed cornflakes or crackers mixed with melted butter, salt, and black pepper. First, combine the potatoes, cheese, sour cream, soup, butter, onions, and seasonings inside a large bowl. Spread the mixture into a baking dish before topping everything with crushed cornflakes or crackers mixed with melted butter. Bake slowly until golden brown and bubbling around the edges. The top should become crisp while the inside stays soft, creamy, and rich. Serve warm beside ham, rolls, vegetables, or coffee during large gatherings and community meals. Simple, heavy, comforting. A church potluck classic quietly served across generations of American communities during some of life's most difficult moments. And maybe recipes like this still survive because they remind people that food once meant more than convenience. Sometimes it meant showing up for one another when words alone were not enough.
But while casseroles and comfort food brought entire communities together during difficult moments, some church recipes became unforgettable simply because they felt joyful enough to brighten every gathering they appeared at.
Few church potluck desserts captured the spirit of old American gatherings quite like Coca-Cola Cake. At first glance, the recipe sounds unusual. Soda inside chocolate cake? But throughout the American South during the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, recipes built around familiar household products became incredibly popular inside church cookbooks, family kitchens, and community potluck dinners. And somehow, Coca-Cola Cake became one of the most beloved desserts of them all. The recipe reflected a very specific era of American life when brand name ingredients, convenience foods, handwritten recipe cards, and community gatherings blended together into a unique kind of homemade cooking culture. Inside church kitchens and small-town homes across the South, Coca-Cola was already part of everyday life, so using it inside desserts didn't feel strange at all. The soda added sweetness, moisture, and a soft texture that helped create rich chocolate cakes perfect for feeding large groups during church dinners and celebrations. And visually, the dessert became unforgettable. Warm chocolate frosting poured directly over fresh cake while still hot. The smell of cocoa and sugar filling crowded kitchens before Sunday gatherings. Large sheet cakes carried carefully into fellowship halls beside casseroles, pies, coffee pots, and folding tables already covered with homemade food. For many Americans, desserts like this became deeply connected to church culture itself. Children waiting impatiently near dessert tables after long Sunday services. Families balancing paper plates filled with homemade food while conversations echoed softly through community halls. Volunteers slicing enormous cakes into dozens of pieces beneath fluorescent lights while coffee brewed endlessly nearby. And somewhere near the center of every dessert table, there was often Coca-Cola Cake. Even today, the recipe still feels deeply nostalgic because it represents a version of American community life built around homemade food, handwritten cookbooks, and small gatherings where nearly everyone knew each other by name. And unlike modern desserts designed mainly for appearance, old church cakes focused entirely on comfort. Rich frosting, soft texture, large portions, enough sweetness to make people stay at the table a little longer after dinner ended. To recreate traditional Coca-Cola cake today, you would need flour, sugar, cocoa powder, butter, Coca-Cola, buttermilk, eggs, baking soda, and vanilla. For the frosting, butter, cocoa powder, powdered sugar, and Coca-Cola. First, combine the dry ingredients before heating butter and Coca-Cola together in a saucepan. Mix everything carefully with eggs, buttermilk, and vanilla until smooth. Bake the cake until soft and fully set. While still warm, pour rich chocolate frosting over the top so it melts slightly into the cake itself. Some families added chopped pecans depending on regional traditions. Serve in large squares beside coffee during church dinners, family gatherings, and holiday potlucks. Sweet, rich, comforting. A church potluck classic once shared across countless American community halls during the golden age of homemade comfort food. And maybe desserts like this still survive because they remind people of a quieter America where recipes were passed between neighbors,
conversations lasted longer, and homemade food brought entire communities together around the same table. Many of these church potluck recipes disappeared quietly over time. Some survived only inside stained community cookbooks, handwritten family cards, and the memories of people who still remember folding tables covered with homemade food after Sunday services. But together, these recipes still tell the story of an older America, built around neighbors helping neighbors, church gatherings, warm casseroles, homemade desserts, and communities that once felt far more connected than they do today. And maybe that's why forgotten recipes still feel comforting. Because behind every old dish is the memory of people gathering together, not just to eat, but to share time, conversation, and the feeling of belonging around the same table.